Why did Hitler persecute the Jews? It is one of the most haunting and consequential questions in all of human history. How did one of Europe's most culturally and intellectually vibrant communities become the target of the most systematic, state-sponsored genocide the world had ever seen? How did a country known for Beethoven, Goethe, and Einstein transform itself within the space of a single decade into a machine of industrial murder? And what drove the man at the center of it all, Adolf Hitler, to dedicate so much of his life, his political energy, and ultimately his nation's resources to the destruction of an entire people? These are not simple questions, and they do not have simple answers. The truth is rooted in centuries of European history, in the psychology of a broken and bitter man, in the fertile soil of post-war humiliation, economic despair, and political chaos. The story of why Hitler persecuted the Jews is a story about ideology and hatred, yes, but it is also a story about fear, propaganda, scapegoating, pseudoscience, political opportunism, and the terrifying fragility of civilized society when its institutions are captured by extremism. In this video, we are going to trace the full arc of that story. From the ancient roots of anti-Semitism in European Christian culture, all the way through Hitler's personal radicalization in Vienna, his transformation of the Nazi Party into an anti-Semitic political weapon, the gradual escalation from legal discrimination to physical violence, and finally, the monstrous culmination of it all in the death camps of the East. So without further ado, let us begin. To understand why Hitler persecuted the Jews, we cannot simply start with Hitler himself. We have to go back much further into the deep roots of European civilization, because the hatred that Hitler weaponized did not originate with him. He did not invent anti-Semitism. He inherited it, sharpened it, industrialized it, and gave it the full power of a modern state. But the raw material was already there, centuries old, embedded in the culture, the religion, and the political folklore of European society. Anti-Semitism, broadly defined as hostility, prejudice, and discrimination directed against Jewish people, has roots stretching back to ancient times, but it took on its most enduring and deadly forms in the Christian European world of the medieval period. For much of the Middle Ages, Jews across Europe lived as a legally distinct and marginalized group. They were frequently barred from owning land, excluded from guilds and many professions, and forced to live in designated areas known as ghettos. In many regions, they were compelled to wear distinctive clothing or badges to mark themselves out from the Christian population. This enforced separateness bred suspicion and resentment on both sides, but the violence always flowed primarily in one direction. The theological basis for medieval Christian anti-Semitism was the accusation of deicide, the charge that the Jewish people bore collective responsibility for the death of Jesus Christ. This theological hostility generated centuries of preaching, art, literature, and popular culture that portrayed Jews in demonic terms. Across medieval Europe, horrifying myths proliferated about Jewish people that bore no relationship to reality, but were repeated so often and so widely that they became accepted as truth. The so-called blood libel, the utterly false claim that Jews murdered Christian children to use their blood in religious rituals, emerged in 12th century England and spread across the continent, triggering massacres, expulsions, and executions for centuries. Jews were blamed for the Black Death, accused of poisoning wells across Europe, and in 1348 and 1349, as the plague ravaged the continent, entire Jewish communities were wiped out in retaliatory massacres from Spain to Poland. These events were not fringe episodes. They reflected a deeply embedded cultural prejudice that existed at every level of European society. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century did not improve matters. Martin Luther, whose break with the Catholic Church transformed European Christianity, began his religious career with some moderate statements about Jewish people, but ended it writing some of the most virulently anti-Semitic texts in the German language. In 1543, Luther published a pamphlet titled On the Jews and Their Lies, which called for the burning of synagogues, the destruction of Jewish homes, the confiscation of Jewish religious books, and the prohibition of rabbinical teaching. He called Jews a base, whoring people, and this document, written by the founder of German Protestantism, would be cited enthusiastically by Nazi propagandists 4 centuries later. The fact that this kind of extreme hatred could come from a figure as revered as Luther tells us something important about how deeply anti-Semitism was woven into the fabric of European Christian culture. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the nature of anti-Semitism began to shift in important ways. The Enlightenment and its aftermath brought formal legal emancipation to Jewish communities across much of Western Europe. The French Revolution declared Jews to be citizens with equal rights in 1791, and over the following decades, emancipation spread through the German states, Austria, and eventually most of Europe. For the first time in centuries, Jewish people could participate fully in public life, attend universities, enter professions, and rise in economic and cultural standing. And in many cases, they did so spectacularly. Jewish people became prominent in medicine, law, journalism, banking, the arts, and academia. This rapid rise in visibility and influence, far from reducing anti-Semitism, paradoxically intensified it among those who resented the change. The 19th century saw the emergence of what scholars call racial anti-Semitism, a new and more dangerous form of the old hatred. Where medieval Christian anti-Semitism had been primarily theological, accusing Jews of the wrong religion, racial anti-Semitism argued that Jewishness was a biological condition, an inherited racial characteristic that could not be changed even by conversion to Christianity. This new ideology drew on the pseudo-scientific theories of race that proliferated in 19th century Europe, themselves entangled with the misapplication of Charles Darwin's theories of natural selection to human societies, in a movement known as social Darwinism. Thinkers like the Frenchman Arthur de Gobineau, who published an essay on the inequality of the human races in the 1850s, and the German-British writer Houston Stewart Chamberlain, whose 1899 book The Foundations of the 19th Century became enormously influential in Germany, argued that history was fundamentally a story of racial conflict, and that the so-called Aryan race, broadly identified with Germanic and Nordic peoples, was locked in an eternal struggle for survival against what they characterized as corrupting, inferior races, with the Jews at the top of the list of enemies. This racial theory gave anti-Semitism a new kind of intellectual veneer. It dressed up ancient hatreds in the language of science, biology, and national destiny. It transformed Jews not merely into religious or cultural outsiders, but into an existential threat to the health and survival of the German nation. And crucially, because Jewishness was now defined as a racial rather than a religious identity, the age-old escape route of conversion was no longer available. You could not stop being Jewish by going to church. You were what you were born. And according to this ideology, what you were born was the enemy. This was the intellectual environment into which Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, in the small Austrian town of Braunau am Inn. Adolf Hitler's early life does not immediately suggest the monster he would become. He was the fourth of 6 children born to Alois Hitler, a mid-ranking customs official, and his wife Clara, a domestic servant. Alois was a stern, domineering figure who had worked hard to rise from peasant origins into the lower middle class and who harboured ambitions for his son's future in the civil service. Hitler resisted these plans intensely, dreaming instead of becoming an artist. The clash between father and son was bitter and unresolved when Alois died suddenly of a lung hemorrhage in January 1903. Hitler was 13 years old. His mother, Clara, whom he adored with an intensity that bordered on the pathological, would survive until December 1907, dying of breast cancer at the age of 47. Her death devastated Hitler, and he carried a photograph of her with him until the day he died. By several accounts, the Jewish doctor who had treated her, Eduard Bloch, went out of his way to provide care that Clara could not afford, and Hitler thanked him personally, and expressed gratitude for his kindness. This makes what came later all the more complicated and disturbing. Hitler's radicalization into anti-Semitism did not happen overnight. It appears to have accelerated significantly during his years in Vienna, a city that would prove decisive in shaping his worldview. Hitler arrived in Vienna in 1907, hoping to be admitted to the Academy of Fine Arts, which he believed was his true calling. He was rejected twice, in 1907 and again in 1908, a humiliation that he never fully recovered from psychologically. With his mother dead, his artistic dreams crushed, and no profession or qualifications to fall back on, Hitler spent the years between roughly 1908 and 1913 drifting in Vienna, living in homeless shelters and cheap hostels, surviving on the occasional sale of watercolor paintings and postcards. These were years of profound failure, poverty, and resentment, and they were also years of intense political self-education. Vienna, in the early 20th century, was a boiling cauldron of nationalist, racial, and political ideologies. It was also, by European standards, a city with a large and highly visible Jewish population. Vienna's mayor at the time was Karl Lueger, a charismatic and enormously popular politician who had built his career on a platform of Christian social populism and virulent antisemitism. Lueger's rhetoric, which blamed Jewish bankers, journalists, and intellectuals for Vienna's social problems, drew thunderous applause from the city's lower middle-class voters. Hitler attended Lueger's public speeches and was deeply impressed by the man's political style, his ability to channel popular resentment into electoral success, and his skillful use of anti-Semitic rhetoric as a political mobilizing tool. Hitler would later describe Lueger as the greatest German mayor of all time. He also immersed himself in the anti-Semitic press and pamphlet literature that circulated freely in Vienna. Publications like the Ostara pamphlets, written by a former monk named Jörg Lanz von Liebenfels, promoted a bizarre mixture of racial theory, occultism, and anti-Semitism that portrayed history as a cosmic struggle between the heroic Aryan master race and a coalition of inferior races led by the Jews. Whether Hitler read these pamphlets directly is debated by historians, but the ideas they contained were part of the ambient intellectual atmosphere of Vienna that he soaked up during these formative years. By the time he left Vienna for Munich in May 1913, Hitler was already developing the core elements of the worldview he would later expound in Mein Kampf and implement from the Chancellery. It is important to pause here and ask a question that many people wonder about. Was Hitler sincere in his anti-Semitism, or was it primarily a cynical political tool? This question has been debated by historians for decades, and the answer is both. The evidence strongly suggests that Hitler's anti-Semitism was genuine, rooted in real psychological conviction that had been developing since at least his Vienna years. His private conversations, his diaries, his table talk recorded during the war, all reflect a consistent and obsessive hatred of Jewish people that goes far beyond what would be necessary for political calculation. At the same time, Hitler was also a supremely calculating politician who understood precisely how anti-Semitism could function as a mobilizing tool, a scapegoat mechanism, and a way to concentrate popular anger and redirect it toward a conveniently defined enemy. The two dimensions were not contradictory. They reinforced each other. His genuine hatred made his political exploitation of anti-Semitism more convincing, and his political success in turn reinforced his belief that his ideology was correct. Before we can fully understand Hitler's anti-Semitism, we also need to understand the catastrophic context of Germany's defeat in World War I, because that defeat did not simply create the political conditions for Hitler's rise. It created the psychological wound that his entire ideology was designed to explain and avenge. Germany's collapse in November 1918 was genuinely traumatic for millions of German citizens, and particularly for German soldiers who could not understand how a war that had been fought to a stalemate on foreign soil had ended in such sudden and humiliating defeat. Within days of the armistice, the German military establishment began promoting what would become known as the Dolchstoßlegende, or stab-in-the-back myth, the claim that Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield but had been betrayed from within by socialists, communists, defeatists and Jews working to undermine the war effort. This myth had essentially no basis in historical reality. Germany lost the war because it ran out of men and resources in the face of an alliance that included the enormous industrial capacity of the United States, which had entered the war in 1917. But the myth was politically convenient and psychologically satisfying, and it spread like wildfire through German nationalist circles. The stab-in-the-back myth was catastrophic in its effects because it prevented Germany from honestly reckoning with the reasons for its defeat, and instead directed the desire for revenge inward against internal enemies. And in the conspiratorial worldview of the far right, the internal enemies were always ultimately traceable to one source: the Jews. Never mind that Jewish Germans had served in the German military in disproportionately high numbers during the war, with over 100,000 Jewish soldiers serving in the German army and 12,000 dying for their country. Never mind that Jewish Germans were overwhelmingly patriotic citizens who had enthusiastically supported the war effort. In the paranoid logic of the stab in the back narrative, the visible success of Jewish people in journalism, banking and trade was reframed as evidence not of hard work and talent, but of sinister manipulation. The very visibility and success that emancipation had made possible was turned against Jewish people as proof of their supposedly malevolent influence. Hitler absorbed this mythology completely and made it central to his political message. When he joined the tiny German Workers' Party in Munich in 1919, soon to be renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, or Nazis, he found a political home that shared his obsessions and where his talents as an orator could find their fullest expression. Hitler's speaking ability was genuinely extraordinary. Those who heard him in the beer halls of Munich in the early 1920s, even those who were skeptical of his message, described being swept up in the emotional force of his delivery. He had an instinctive gift for reading audiences, for building from quiet, almost conversational beginnings to screaming, table-pounding climaxes, for voicing the anger and resentment that his listeners felt but could not articulate. And the target of that anger, in speech after speech, was always the same. The Jews, portrayed as the invisible hand behind Germany's defeat, the Weimar Republic's weak and corrupt democracy, the hyperinflation that had wiped out middle-class savings, the unemployment, the social instability, the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles. Everything bad that had happened to Germany was laid at the feet of an international Jewish conspiracy. It was in this period, between 1919 and 1923, that Hitler first attracted serious national attention, culminating in the disastrously misconceived beer hall putsch of November 1923, in which Hitler attempted to seize power in Munich by force, hoping to trigger a national revolution. The putsch failed completely. 16 Nazis and 4 police officers were killed in the confrontation at the Feldherrnhalle. Hitler was arrested, tried for treason, and sentenced to 5 years in Landsberg. Prison, though he would serve only 9 months before being released, but his time in prison proved unexpectedly productive. With the help of his devoted deputy Rudolf Hess, Hitler dictated what would become Mein Kampf, My Struggle, a rambling, repetitive, and deeply revealing combination of autobiography, political manifesto, and paranoid racial fantasy that would go on to become one of the most consequential and destructive books ever published. Mein Kampf is essential reading for anyone who wants to understand why Hitler persecuted the Jews, because in it he lays out his ideology in his own words with a clarity and totality that leave no room for doubt about his intentions. The book's central thesis is straightforward and terrifying. Hitler believed that history was fundamentally a struggle between races, and that the German people, who he identified as the core of the Aryan race, faced an existential threat from what he described as the Jewish race. He portrayed the Jews not merely as a foreign people or a different religion, but as a parasitic entity, a biological threat to the racial purity and vitality of the Aryan host. He wrote that the Aryan is the Prometheus of mankind, and that the preservation of Aryan blood was humanity's highest obligation. And he was explicit that the removal of Jewish influence from German life was not merely a political preference, but a biological necessity for the survival of civilization itself. The racial theory in Mein Kampf is wild pseudoscience, but it was pseudoscience that dressed itself in the language of respected academic disciplines. Hitler drew on the eugenics movement, which had been gaining academic and political respectability in Europe and America since the late 19th century, and which advocated the improvement of the human population through selective breeding and the prevention of reproduction by those deemed unfit. He drew on the social Darwinist tradition that applied Darwin's concept of natural selection to human societies and argued that competition between racial groups was the engine of history. He drew on the work of racial theorists like Hans F. K. Günther, whose 1922 book, Racial Typology of the German People, provided a supposedly scientific framework for racial classification that became enormously influential in Nazi circles. The veneer of scientific respectability was important because it allowed Hitler and the Nazis to present what was essentially medieval superstition in modern dress, to claim that their persecution of Jews was not hatred, but hygiene, not prejudice, but prevention, not murder, but medicine. The ideology that Hitler laid out in Mein Kampf had several interlocking components that together explain the totality of his persecution of the Jews. The first was the concept of racial purity, the idea that the German people were a distinct racial entity whose purity and vitality were being corrupted by intermarriage with Jews and other supposedly inferior races. The second was the conspiracy theory, the belief that there existed a unified, globally coordinated Jewish conspiracy working to undermine and destroy Aryan civilization from within, through the control of banks, the press, art, culture, and politics. This conspiracy theory, as we will see, was immensely flexible and could be applied to virtually any negative development. The third was the existential framing that transformed persecution from a choice into a necessity. If Jews were not merely different but actually dangerous, not just foreign but actively hostile and destructive, then eliminating their influence was not oppression, but self-defense. This rhetorical move, transforming the victim into the aggressor, is one of the oldest and most effective tools of genocidal ideology. And the fourth component was what Hitler called Lebensraum, or living space. This was the idea that Germany needed to expand eastward into the territories of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union to acquire the agricultural land and natural resources necessary for the German people to achieve their racial destiny. The peoples of Eastern Europe, Slavs, and especially the Jewish populations who lived among them, were in Hitler's worldview both obstacles to be removed and evidence of racial degeneracy to be eliminated. The connection between antisemitism and Lebensraum was crucial, because it meant that Hitler's racial ideology was not merely a domestic German obsession, but a blueprint for continental conquest and mass murder. So this is the ideological framework that Hitler brought with him when he finally achieved power on January 30th, 1933, when President Paul von Hindenburg appointed him Chancellor of Germany. The question then becomes how that ideology was translated into policy and how it escalated, step by step, from legal discrimination to mass murder. The first phase of Nazi persecution of the Jews, roughly from 1933 to 1935, was characterized by legal and economic measures designed to exclude Jewish people from German public life. This phase was not always as systematically directed from the top as it might appear in retrospect. Within the Nazi movement, there were competing centers of power, conflicting pressures from radical activists who wanted immediate violence and more cautious voices who worried about economic disruption and international reaction. The result was a somewhat improvised combination of centrally directed legislation and grassroots anti-Semitic violence that the government then either encouraged, tolerated, or attempted to channel into more controlled forms. The very first national action against Jews came just 2 months after Hitler took power. On April 1, 1933, the Nazi Party organized a nationwide boycott of Jewish-owned businesses, calling on Germans to refuse to patronize Jewish shops, doctors, lawyers, and other professionals. Stormtroopers stood outside Jewish businesses with signs reading, "Kauft nicht bei Juden," do not buy, from Jews, and photographed those who ignored the boycott. In many places, the boycott was accompanied by violence and intimidation. The boycott was only partially successful commercially, as many Germans continued to patronize Jewish businesses whose products and services they valued, but it served an important psychological and political function. It made anti-Semitism a public, collective act. It normalized the idea of treating Jews as a separate and hostile group, and it sent an unmistakable signal to the Jewish community and to the world about the direction in which Germany was heading. Just 1 week later, on April 7, 1933, the Nazi government passed the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, which provided the legal basis for dismissing Jews and political opponents from government jobs. Jewish civil servants who had not served in the First World War were removed from their positions. This law was quickly followed by a series of similar measures excluding Jews. From other professions, Jewish lawyers were disbarred, Jewish journalists were fired from their publications. Jewish professors were removed from their university positions. Jewish doctors were expelled from the national health insurance system. In one area after another, the legal and economic basis of Jewish participation in German public life was systematically dismantled. These measures affected hundreds of thousands of people and caused enormous suffering and disruption. Many German Jews who could do so began to emigrate in the early years of the Nazi regime. Between 1933 and 1938, approximately 150,000 Jews left Germany, roughly a quarter of the pre-Nazi German Jewish population of around 525,000 people. Those who stayed often did so out of deep attachment to their German identity and a belief, encouraged by occasional periods of relative quiet, that things could not possibly get worse. They were profoundly wrong. The year 1935 marked a significant escalation with the promulgation of the Nuremberg Laws, announced by Hitler at the annual Nazi Party rally in Nuremberg in September of that year. The Nuremberg Laws were a package of racial legislation that formalized the exclusion of Jews from German citizenship and prohibited marriage and sexual relations between Jews and non-Jewish Germans. The first of the laws, the Reich Citizenship Law, created two categories of people in Germany: Reich citizens who were of German or related blood, and subjects, a lesser category that included Jews. Only Reich citizens had full political rights. The second law, the Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor, prohibited marriages between Jews and non-Jewish Germans, forbade extramarital sexual relations between them, prohibited Jews from employing German women under 45 in their homes, and prohibited Jews from displaying the German flag. A supplementary decree issued in November 1935 defined who exactly was a Jew for legal purposes, establishing a complex classification system based on the number of Jewish grandparents a person had. The Nuremberg Laws were a turning point. They encoded racial antisemitism into German law. They transformed Jews from citizens into a legally inferior caste. And they drew a hard biological boundary around the Jewish community that made it impossible for anyone defined as Jewish to legally integrate or assimilate into German society, no matter what they did or believed. For the tens of thousands of Germans who had converted from Judaism to Christianity generations earlier, or who had only one Jewish grandparent, or who had never thought of themselves as Jewish at all, the laws were a brutal and disorienting shock. Suddenly they were defined not by their beliefs, their culture, their self-identification, or their service to Germany, but by their blood, by the religion of grandparents they had never known. The power of racial ideology to override all other human categories was demonstrated in the most personal and devastating terms. What is important to understand about this period is that the persecution was not proceeding according to a fixed, pre-planned blueprint that had been laid out in advance and was now being implemented on schedule. The evidence suggests that the Nazis were improvising to a significant degree, responding to internal party pressures, public reactions, international criticism, and economic realities. The radical wing of the movement, represented by figures like Julius Streicher, the editor of the viciously anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer, and the S.A. Brownshirts who engaged in spontaneous violence against Jews, constantly pushed for faster and more extreme measures. The more cautious wing, represented by figures in the economic establishment who worried about disruption to German industry and trade, pushed for moderation. Hitler's genius, if one can use that word for something so evil, was in navigating between these pressures and using the most radical elements of his movement to continuously ratchet up the pressure on Jewish people while maintaining just enough control to prevent international boycotts and economic isolation from seriously damaging Germany's rearmament program. Throughout this period, the propaganda machine built by Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's Minister of Propaganda and Public Enlightenment, was working continuously to reshape the consciousness of ordinary Germans. Goebbels was a genuinely brilliant propagandist, one of the most effective in history, and his work in normalizing anti-Semitism in German society was central to the entire Nazi project. Goebbels controlled the radio, the press, the cinema, the theatre, and the visual arts. He ensured that anti-Semitic content was woven into every form of popular entertainment and public discourse. Films like Der ewige Jude, The Eternal Jew, released in 1940, presented grotesquely dehumanizing caricatures of Jewish people, comparing them to rats and insects. Children's books like Der Giftpilz, The Poisonous Mushroom, published in 1938 by Streicher's publishing house, taught young Germans that Jews were dangerous and evil. School curricula were redesigned to incorporate racial theory and antisemitism as fundamental subjects. Daily newspapers, almost all of which were now under Nazi control or censorship, presented a steady diet of anti-Semitic stories, caricatures, and commentary. The effect of this sustained propaganda campaign on the German public was complex and varied. Some Germans were true believers who embraced the Nazi ideology enthusiastically. Others were passive conformists who went along with the persecution because resistance was dangerous and the benefits of compliance, including access to Jewish property and positions vacated by dismissed Jews, were tangible. A smaller minority resisted, hid Jewish neighbors, refused to participate in boycotts, or helped people escape. But the overall effect of 12 years of totalitarian propaganda was to create a society in which anti-Semitism was normalized, in which violence against Jews was at worst a minor social transgression and at best a patriotic duty, and in which the psychological distance necessary for ordinary people to participate in or tolerate mass murder was steadily and systematically constructed. The year 1938 brought the first major explosion of organized violence against Jews in Germany and Austria, which had been annexed by Germany in the Anschluss of March 1938. The pretext was the assassination of a German diplomat in Paris. On the night of November 9th and 10th, 1938, Nazi stormtroopers and ordinary civilians, organized and directed by the Nazi Party, but presenting the appearance of a spontaneous popular uprising, attacked Jewish communities across Germany and Austria. Synagogues were burned, Jewish businesses were smashed and looted, Jewish homes were broken into, and their occupants beaten and terrorized. Around 100 Jewish people were killed in the immediate violence, though the actual number was probably higher. Around 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps, primarily Dachau, Sachsenhausen, and Buchenwald, where they were subjected to brutal treatment and were released only on condition that they agreed to emigrate and surrender their property. The streets were littered with broken glass from shattered shop windows, which gave the event its name in German, Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. Kristallnacht was a watershed. It demonstrated that the Nazi regime was willing to use large-scale organized violence against Jewish people, not just legal and economic discrimination. It showed that the persecution was not going to slow down or moderate, and it created a financial windfall for the Nazi state, because the Jewish community was then fined 1 billion Reichsmarks, supposedly to pay for the damage caused by the pogrom, while any insurance money paid out to Jewish property owners was confiscated by the state. Kristallnacht accelerated emigration enormously. In the 12 months following the pogrom, over 100,000 Jews left Germany and Austria. But the window for escape was rapidly narrowing, and for the millions of Jews in Eastern Europe who were not yet under German rule, the catastrophe was still several years away. The question of why ordinary Germans participated in or tolerated the persecution of their Jewish neighbours is one that has occupied historians for decades. The answers are uncomfortable, because they suggest that the capacity for cruelty and moral abdication is not restricted to a particular nation or culture, but is latent in human societies generally and can be activated under the right conditions. The political scientist Hannah Arendt, herself a Jewish refugee from Germany who would go on to cover the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961, coined the phrase the banality of evil to describe the phenomenon by which ordinary people can commit or facilitate extraordinary horrors, not through malice or fanaticism, but simply through bureaucratic routine, careerism, and the abdication of moral judgment. Eichmann, who was responsible for organizing the logistics of the deportation of millions of Jews to the extermination camps, was not a monster in any obvious personal sense. He was a bureaucrat, a middle manager of genocide who did his job efficiently and without apparent personal hatred, following orders, meeting quotas, and filling out the paperwork that kept the machinery of murder running smoothly. The historian Christopher Browning, in his landmark 1992 study Ordinary Men, examined the case of Reserve Police Battalion 101, a unit of middle-aged German policemen who were ordered to shoot Jewish civilians in Poland in 1942. These were not fanatical SS ideologues, they were working-class men with families, many of whom had no strong Nazi beliefs. Their commanding officer explicitly gave them the option to opt out of the killing. Only a handful did. The vast majority went along with the murders, in part because of group conformity, peer pressure, careerism, and what Browning calls the normalization of extreme behavior through its repetition. Once you have committed a great evil once and survived it, committing it again and again becomes progressively easier. The first murder is the most difficult. The 10,000th requires no more emotional effort than filing a form. These findings do not excuse what happened. They explain it. And the explanation is more disturbing in some ways than the idea of a nation uniquely possessed by evil, because it suggests that what happened in Germany could, under the right conditions, happen elsewhere. The conditions that enabled the Holocaust were built over years of deliberate political effort. The dismantling of democratic institutions, the elimination of press freedom, and independent civil society, the use of propaganda to dehumanize a target group, the creation of legal frameworks that normalize discrimination, the incremental escalation of persecution that habituated people to each new outrage, and the mobilization of material self-interest through the promise of Jewish property and positions for those who went along with the system. But we should return to the specific question of Hitler's motivations, because the evidence strongly suggests that Hitler was not simply a cynical opportunist who used antisemitism as a political tool while remaining personally indifferent to it. The testimony of those who knew him well, the documentary record of his private statements, and the pattern of his decision-making all point to an antisemitism that was genuinely and obsessively felt. Hermann Rauschning, a Nazi official who broke with the party and wrote a memoir of his conversations with Hitler in the early 1930s, quoted Hitler as saying that if the Jew did not exist, we would have to invent him. This is sometimes cited as evidence of cynicism, but in context it suggests something more like the reasoning of someone who believes so completely in a conspiracy that they feel the conspiracy's existence is inevitable and that its discovery and destruction is their historical mission. Hitler appears to have genuinely believed that he was fighting a cosmic battle against an existential enemy. The evidence for Hitler's sincere anti-Semitism is also found in the timing and the costs of his decisions. As Germany began losing the war in late 1942 and early 1943, the resources devoted to the extermination of the Jews were maintained and in some cases intensified even when military considerations clearly argued for redeploying those resources elsewhere. In Hungary in 1944, when the Wehrmacht desperately needed every available train and every able-bodied man to resist the Soviet advance, Hitler insisted on using the Hungarian rail network to transport Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz for immediate gassing. Over 400,000 Hungarian Jews were murdered in a matter of weeks, in the middle of a military crisis that was costing Germany the war. This is not the behavior of a cynical politician who used anti-Semitism merely for domestic political purposes. This is the behavior of someone who considered the murder of Jews to be as important, or more important, than winning the war. What were the specific factors within Hitler's own psychology that drove this obsession? Historians and psychologists have proposed several theories. One widely discussed theory focuses on the relationship between Hitler's failures in Vienna and the anti-Semitism he encountered there. In this reading, Hitler's rage at his own inadequacy, his failure as an artist, his poverty and social marginalization found a convenient external object in the Jewish people who were visibly successful in the fields of culture and commerce that he could not access. The resentment of the failed aspirant toward the successful outsider is a recognizable psychological pattern, and Vienna's particular combination of Jewish success and anti-Semitic resentment may have provided the emotional fuel for Hitler's later ideology. Another theory focuses on the connection between Hitler's anti-Semitism and his wartime trauma. Hitler served in World War I as a regimental messenger, a relatively safe position in the rear, but he did see action, was wounded twice, and was temporarily blinded in a British gas attack in October 1918. He was in a military hospital when Germany surrendered. The shock of the defeat was enormous, and there is evidence that his anti-Semitism intensified significantly in the immediate aftermath of the war. Some historians, including Brigitte Hamann, have argued that Hitler's anti-Semitism was more moderate and less central to his worldview in Vienna than he later claimed in Mein Kampf, and that it was really the experience of Germany's defeat and the Weimar Republic's political chaos that radicalized him fully. Whatever the precise psychological mechanism, the result was a worldview of remarkable internal consistency and terrible coherence. Hitler believed, with the conviction of a religious zealot, that the Jewish people were the source of all evil, the hidden hand behind capitalism and communism simultaneously, the force responsible for Germany's military defeat, and the biological threat to Aryan civilization's survival. This worldview explained everything and was immune to counter-evidence. If Germany suffered economically, it was because of Jewish financiers. If German culture was degenerating, it was because of Jewish artists and intellectuals. If Germany lost a war, it was because of Jewish traitors and saboteurs. If other countries criticized Germany's policies, it was because they were controlled by Jewish interests. The conspiracy theory was perfectly constructed to be unfalsifiable. Every piece of contradictory evidence could be reinterpreted as further evidence of the conspiracy's depth and cunning. Now, it is vital to examine the specific economic dimension of the persecution, because antisemitism in Germany was not purely ideological. It also served very concrete material interest. Throughout the period of Nazi rule, the persecution of Jews was accompanied by what Germans called Arisierung, or Aryanization, the forced transfer of Jewish-owned businesses, properties and assets into the hands of non-Jewish Germans. This was not an incidental byproduct of the persecution. It was one of its central mechanisms. Jewish business owners were first pressured to sell their enterprises at far below market value, then eventually forced out of business altogether. Jewish homes and apartment buildings were confiscated. Jewish art collections, bank accounts, and personal valuables were seized. The scale of this economic plunder was staggering. Estimates suggest that German Jews were stripped of approximately 60% of their total wealth between 1933 and 1939, with much of the rest lost in the subsequent years of total persecution. This economic plunder served several functions simultaneously. It provided direct material benefits to the Nazi state, which was funding an enormous rearmament program and needed capital. It provided tangible rewards for ordinary Germans who acquired Jewish businesses, apartments, or personal property at knockdown prices, thereby giving them a concrete material stake in the continuation of the persecution. And it destroyed the economic foundation of the Jewish community, making emigration more difficult even as persecution made it more desirable, since people who had been stripped of their assets had little to start a new life with in another country. The economist Götz Ali, in his provocative 2005 study Hitler's Beneficiaries, argues that the economic benefits of Jewish persecution, including not just the direct plunder of Jewish wealth but also the broader looting of occupied countries, were essential to maintaining popular support for the Nazi regime by funding generous welfare programs and military pay that kept ordinary Germans relatively comfortable even in wartime. Whether or not one accepts Ali's full argument, the material dimension of the persecution was clearly real and significant. The political dimension was equally important. Antisemitism served as an extraordinarily powerful political tool because it provided what sociologists call a negative integrator, an external enemy whose supposed threat could unite an otherwise divided population. Germany in 1933 was a profoundly divided society, split between communists and social democrats, Catholics and Protestants, rural conservatives and urban workers, industrial elites and the middle classes who had been ruined by inflation and depression. Antisemitism was one of the very few things that could appeal across many of these divides because versions of it existed in virtually every segment of German society. By defining the Jew as the common enemy of all real Germans, Hitler could construct a sense of national community, the Volksgemeinschaft or people's community, that bridged these other divisions and directed popular anger outward rather than at the Nazi regime itself. There was also a specific political logic to making the Jews the target, rather than some other group. The Jewish community in Germany was small, roughly 1% of the total population. It was highly visible and culturally successful, which made it easy to portray as disproportionately powerful and thereby threatening. It lacked reliable political allies because the left was as willing to sacrifice Jewish interests as the right when political calculations required it. And it could be connected to a broader international network of supposed Jewish power through the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that were already widely believed. A small, successful and isolated minority portrayed as secretly powerful and globally connected is an almost ideal target for a scapegoating political strategy. The Nazis did not create this situation, but they exploited it with ruthless efficiency. Let us now turn to the role of the German churches in the persecution of the Jews, because this is an aspect of the story that is often glossed over but is essential to understanding how the Holocaust became possible. Germany was a Christian country with a roughly equal split between Lutheranism and Catholicism, and the churches were among the most powerful institutions in German civil society. Had the German churches spoken out clearly and collectively against the persecution of the Jews from its beginning, it is at least possible, though far from certain, that the escalation to genocide might have been slowed or complicated. Instead, the record of the German churches in the Nazi period is, with notable exceptions, one of accommodation, complicity, and silence. The German Protestant churches were deeply divided in their response to Nazism. A significant faction, the German Christians movement, enthusiastically embraced Nazi ideology and attempted to purge Jewish Christians from church membership and remove the Old Testament from the Bible on the grounds that it was too Jewish. A smaller faction, the Confessing Church, resisted the Nazi takeover of the Protestant churches and produced the Barmen Declaration of 1934, which asserted the independence of the church from state ideology. But even within the Confessing Church, opposition to the Nazi regime's treatment of Jews was limited and focused primarily on the treatment of Jewish converts to Christianity, rather than on a principled defense of Jewish people as such. The Confessing Church's most prominent figure, Pastor Martin Niemöller, who spent 7 years in concentration camps for his resistance to Nazi church policy, was himself an anti-Semite of the traditional Christian variety who had initially supported Hitler. The Catholic Church's position was shaped by the Concordat it had signed with Hitler's government in July 1933, just 6 months after he came to power. In exchange for the Catholic Church's political neutrality, the Nazi government agreed to respect the Church's educational institutions and religious orders. From the Nazi government's perspective, the Concordat gave the regime enormous international legitimacy. From the Catholic Church's perspective, it secured institutional protections that turned out to be substantially illusory, as the Nazis later violated their commitments. Pope Pius XI issued an encyclical in 1937, Mit brennender Sorge, with burning concern, that criticized Nazi racial ideology and the regime's violation of the Concordat, and it was read from pulpits across Germany. But the encyclical did not specifically mention Jews and the Vatican's overall record in this period, and especially under Pius XII, who succeeded, in 1939, has been the subject of bitter historical controversy for decades. The significance of the Church's response, or lack of it, goes beyond institutional history. It tells us something profound about how antisemitism was embedded in the very foundations of European Christian culture. The churches had been the primary transmitters of anti-Jewish theology for 15 centuries. They had preached the deicide myth. They had enforced Jewish legal inferiority in the medieval world. They had tolerated or encouraged pogroms. When Hitler escalated from legal discrimination to organized violence, the theological framework for condemning the persecution was genuinely underdeveloped, because the churches had never fully renounced the tradition of hostility to Jews that was woven into their own history. Some individual clerics did speak out and paid for it with imprisonment or death. Maximilian Kolbe, a Polish Franciscan priest who was later canonized as a saint, died in Auschwitz in 1941, after volunteering to die in place of a condemned stranger. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German Lutheran pastor and theologian, was executed in April 1945 for his involvement in the resistance movement that included the July 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler. These were genuine acts of moral heroism, but they were exceptions that threw the general failure of the churches into even sharper relief. Let us also examine the international dimension of the persecution, because the story of why the Jews were persecuted is not only a story about Germany. It is also a story about the world's failure to respond adequately to the persecution when escape was still possible. During the 1930s, as the situation of Jewish people in Germany grew increasingly desperate, the doors to immigration in most countries were either closed or were being closed. In July 1938, 32 nations gathered at a conference in Evian, France, to discuss the refugee crisis created by the Nazi persecution. The results were almost uniformly dismal. Country after country, including the United States, Britain, France, Canada, and Australia, found reasons to severely limit Jewish immigration. The United States, whose immigration quota system heavily favored Northern and Western Europeans, admitted only a fraction of the Jewish immigrants seeking to enter. Britain strictly limited Jewish immigration to Palestine, then under British mandate, out of concern for Arab political sensibilities and fears of destabilization. Even the relatively small number of Jewish refugees who were seeking to escape were often turned back, sometimes literally to their deaths. The most notorious example of this failure was the case of the MS St. Louis, a German ocean liner that sailed from Hamburg in May 1939, carrying 937 Jewish refugees who had received Cuban immigration papers. When Cuba refused to honor those papers, the ship was turned away. It then sailed along the Florida coast and applied for entry to the United States, which also refused. Canada refused as well. The ship was eventually forced to return to Europe, where the passengers were distributed among Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Of the 907 passengers who returned to mainland Europe, an estimated 254 were eventually murdered in the Holocaust after Germany occupied those countries. The story of the St. Louis became a symbol of the world's failure to act, a reminder that the Holocaust was not simply imposed on a helpless world, but was enabled by the indifference and self-interest of nations that had the power to offer more refuge and chose not to. The failure of Evian and the turning away of the St. Louis were not lost on Hitler, who cited them as evidence that the world did not actually care about the fate of the Jews and that Germany could do as it wished. Whether or not this argument was entirely accurate, it was not entirely wrong. The international response to the Nazi persecution in the 1930s was inadequate, shaped by economic depression, domestic antisemitism, isolationism, and political expediency. This international failure removed what might have been the most effective brake on the escalation of persecution, namely the threat of serious international consequences for the regime's actions. Now let us turn to the invasion of Poland in September 1939 and the beginning of the war, which represents the next major turning point in the history of the persecution. The conquest of Poland brought approximately 3 million Polish Jews under German control, making the Jewish population subject to Nazi rule 10 times larger almost overnight. This massive expansion of the problem, as the Nazis saw it, created an urgent search for solutions that ultimately led to genocide. The initial German response in occupied Poland was to concentrate the Jewish population into sealed urban ghettos, walled-off sections of major cities where Jews were forced to live in conditions of extreme overcrowding, with inadequate food, medicine, and sanitation. The largest was the Warsaw Ghetto, established in late 1940, which by 1942 held over 400,000 people in an area of about 1.3 square miles. Conditions were deliberately designed to be lethal. Starvation, disease, and cold killed tens of thousands each year. Typhus epidemics swept through the overcrowded streets. The monthly food ration allocated to ghetto residents by the German authorities provided fewer calories than the human body needs, simply to maintain basic metabolic function. The ghettos served several purposes in the Nazi scheme. They concentrated the Jewish population for administrative control. They served as a source of forced labor for German industry and the military. And they were, for a significant faction of the Nazi leadership, a slow-motion extermination mechanism with the expectation that conditions would be lethal enough to reduce the population significantly over time without requiring direct action. Whether the ghetto system was intended from the beginning as a step toward total extermination, or whether it represented an intermediate policy adopted while the Nazi leadership searched for a more definitive solution, is a question that historians have debated extensively. The answer seems to be that the Nazi leadership had a clear goal, the elimination of Jewish life from German-controlled Europe, but the precise means of achieving that goal was still being debated and developed, even as the ghettos were being established. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, represented a further and catastrophic escalation. The war in the East was conceived from the beginning by the Nazi leadership as a war of racial annihilation, not merely a conventional military conflict. Before the invasion began, Hitler told his generals that the war against the Soviet Union was to be a war of destruction, and that it was to be fought with methods of unprecedented brutality. The orders issued to the army before the invasion included the infamous Commissar Order, which required the immediate execution of all captured Soviet political commissars in direct violation of international law. They also included guidance permitting troops to take severe collective measures against civilian populations in response to resistance. Following closely behind the advancing German armies were special mobile killing units called Einsatzgruppen, totaling around 3,000 men, drawn primarily from the SS and police. The Einsatzgruppen's mandate was the systematic shooting of Jews, Soviet officials, Roma people, and anyone else designated as an enemy of the Reich. They operated with terrifying efficiency. By the end of 1941, within 6 months of the invasion's beginning, the Einsatzgruppen and the military units that assisted them had murdered approximately 500,000 people, the vast majority of them Jews. This mass shooting campaign represented a fundamental shift in the nature of the persecution. Where before the Nazis had sought to drive Jews out of German-controlled territory through legal discrimination, economic pressure, and physical violence, now they were simply killing them, on an industrial scale wherever they found them. The most notorious single massacre of this period occurred at Babi Yar, a ravine on the outskirts of Kiev in Ukraine. Between September 29th and 30th, 1941, members of Einsatzgruppe C, assisted by German police units and Ukrainian auxiliary police, shot 33,771 Jews, the entire remaining Jewish population of Kyiv, in a ravine outside the city. The victims were ordered to assemble with their luggage and valuables, marched to the ravine, ordered to undress, and then shot in groups at the edge of the pit. The operation took 2 days. Babi Yar was not an isolated incident, but one of thousands of similar mass shootings carried out across the occupied Soviet Union in 1941 and 1942. The sheer scale of the killing was staggering, and it confronted the SS leadership with what they described in bureaucratic terms as operational challenges, meaning primarily the psychological cost to the executioners and the inefficiency of shooting hundreds of thousands of people one by one. It was this combination of the scale of the killing program, the bureaucratic drive for efficiency, and the ideological imperative to murder every Jew in German-controlled Europe that led to the decision to build dedicated extermination facilities using poison gas as the killing method. The exact timing and the precise decision-making process that led to what the Nazis called the final solution of the Jewish question, the systematic murder of all Jews in Europe, remains somewhat unclear in the historical record, partly because the Nazis deliberately avoided committing certain decisions to paper. What is clear is that by late 1941 the decision had been made, and that the machinery of industrial murder was being constructed with remarkable speed and efficiency. The Wannsee Conference, held on January 20, 1942, in a Berlin suburb, was not the meeting at which the decision to murder the Jews was made. That decision appears to have already been taken by that point. Rather, the Wannsee Conference was an administrative coordination meeting at which senior SS and government officials, representing 15 agencies of the German government, met to coordinate the implementation of the final solution. The meeting was chaired by Reinhard Heydrich, the head of the SS Security Service and one of the most powerful and feared men in the Nazi hierarchy. Adolf Eichmann, Heydrich's expert on Jewish affairs, prepared the minutes. The conference discussed the scope of the operation, which Heydrich identified as encompassing 11 million Jews in Europe, including those in countries not yet under German control. It discussed the logistics of deportation, and it established a bureaucratic framework for coordinating the involvement of multiple government agencies in what was, in plain language, the largest organized murder in human history. The minutes of the Wannsee Conference, discovered by historians after the war, are one of the most chilling documents in existence, not because they are filled with explicit descriptions of murder, but because of precisely the opposite. They discuss the mass killing of millions of people in the calm, antiseptic language of bureaucratic administration. The word killing is never used. The euphemisms evacuation, special treatment, and final solution do the work instead. This deliberate sanitization of language was characteristic of the Nazi killing program throughout. It served to maintain a psychological distance between the bureaucrats making the decisions and the physical reality of what those decisions meant. It also created a kind of institutional deniability that participants could and did later exploit when facing judgment. The extermination program that the Wannsee Conference helped coordinate relied primarily on a network of 6 dedicated extermination camps built in occupied Poland: Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, and Majdanek. These were different from the earlier concentration camps like Dachau and Buchenwald, which had been primarily designed to terrorize and exploit political prisoners. The extermination camps were built for one purpose: to kill people, as many people as quickly as possible, with the greatest possible efficiency. Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec were pure extermination facilities where the only path from arrival to death was measured in hours. Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest and most notorious, combined a labor camp with an extermination facility, with arriving prisoners selected on the platform, some designated for forced labor and the rest, the majority, directed immediately to the gas chambers. The technology of mass killing evolved over the course of the war as the Nazi authorities sought greater efficiency. The initial experiments with gas as a killing method had taken place in Germany itself, in the context of the T4 program, a systematic murder of disabled people that had begun in 1939 with Hitler's direct authorization. Carbon monoxide was initially used in sealed vans and gas chambers, but the Zyklon B insecticide, which produces hydrogen cyanide gas when exposed to air, was found to be more reliable and was adopted at Auschwitz after experiments on Soviet prisoners of war in September 1941. The gas chambers at Auschwitz-Birkenau could kill 2,000 people at a time in a matter of minutes. The bodies were then cremated in industrial-scale ovens. At the peak of the killing program in the summer of 1944, Auschwitz was murdering over 10,000 people per day. The total number killed in the Holocaust is estimated at approximately 6 million Jews, representing roughly two-thirds of the pre-war Jewish population of Europe, along with 5 to 6 million non-Jewish victims, including Roma, Slavic civilians, Soviet prisoners of war, political prisoners, homosexuals, and people with disabilities. These numbers are so vast that they risk becoming abstract. Behind every statistic was an individual human being, a child who would never grow up, a parent who would never see their children again, a scholar whose books would never be written, an artist whose paintings would never be painted, a musician whose music would never be heard. The cultural and human loss was incalculable. One of the most important and often overlooked aspects of understanding why the Holocaust happened is the question of knowledge. Who knew what and when? The myth that ordinary Germans knew nothing about the mass murder of the Jews was a convenient post-war story, but it has been substantially demolished by historical research. The Einsatzgruppen, shootings in the East in 1941 and 1942, involved tens of thousands of executioners, witnesses, and support personnel. Letters home from soldiers serving in the East describe the massacres in varying degrees of detail. The deportation of Jews from cities across Germany, Austria, and the occupied territories to destinations in the East was conducted publicly, with Jews assembled in town squares and loaded onto trains in plain sight of their neighbours. By 1942 and 1943, most Germans were aware that the Jews who had been deported were not merely being resettled in camps in the East, as official propaganda claimed. The SS itself tracked public knowledge of the killings through its internal reports, which noted with concern that people in certain regions were discussing the fate of deported Jews with alarming specificity. The historian Robert Geleitley, in his study Backing Hitler, and Daniel Jonah Goldhagen, in his controversial but important Hitler's Willing Executioners, have both argued from very different methodological perspectives that the level of public knowledge of and complicity in the persecution of the Jews was far higher than the post-war narrative of ignorance suggested. Geleitley emphasizes the public nature of much of the terror and the degree to which ordinary Germans benefited from and supported the regime's actions. Goldhagen goes further, arguing that German society was characterized by what he calls eliminationist antisemitism, a specific and unusually virulent form of the prejudice that made ordinary Germans willing participants in genocide. Many historians have contested aspects of Goldhagen's argument, particularly his claim that German antisemitism was uniquely eliminationist in character, arguing that he understates the role of situational factors, peer pressure, and the mechanisms of totalitarian coercion. But the fundamental point that the Holocaust required the active participation or passive acquiescence of millions of ordinary people, not just a fanatical elite, is now well established. What about resistance? Did Jewish communities resist? And if so, why didn't resistance prevent or at least significantly reduce the killing? These questions are important partly because of the distorted image that sometimes circulates in popular culture of Jewish people going passively to their deaths like lambs to the slaughter. This image is both historically inaccurate and deeply unfair. Jewish resistance to the Nazis took many forms and was more widespread than is commonly recognized. Armed resistance occurred in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of April and May 1943, when the surviving inhabitants of the ghetto, reduced from nearly 500,000 people to under 60,000 by deportations to Treblinka, rose up with improvised weapons against the German forces sent to liquidate the ghetto. Under the command of Mordecai Anielewicz, the Jewish combat organization held out for nearly a month against a far superior German military force, an act of extraordinary courage that stunned the German military command. The uprising was ultimately crushed, and Anielewicz and most of the fighters died, but the symbolic significance of the uprising was enormous and has never been forgotten. Armed uprisings also occurred in the extermination camps themselves. At Treblinka, in August 1943, prisoners who had somehow obtained weapons and explosives set fire to the camp, and approximately 250 people managed to escape during the chaos, though most were recaptured and killed. At Sobibor in October 1943, a group of prisoners led by Soviet prisoner of war Alexander Pechersky killed 11 SS guards and led a mass breakout. Approximately 300 people escaped the camp, of whom about 50 survived the war. At Auschwitz-Birkenau in October 1944, members of the Sonderkommando, the prisoners forced to operate the crematoria, staged an uprising using explosives smuggled in by female prisoners who worked in a munitions factory. They destroyed one of the 4 crematoria before the uprising was crushed. All of the immediate participants were killed, but the courage of those acts, carried out by people who had witnessed unimaginable horrors and had almost no hope of survival, challenges any narrative of passive victimhood. There was also non-armed resistance of many kinds, maintaining cultural and religious life underground, keeping secret schools in the ghettos, writing diaries and hiding archives to ensure that the truth would be known to future generations. One of the most important acts of resistance was the work of Emanuel Ringelblum and his secret archive in the Warsaw Ghetto, known as Oyneg Shabes. Ringelblum organized a team of writers, historians, teachers, and ordinary people to document Jewish life under Nazi occupation, collecting thousands of testimonies, documents, newspapers, and artifacts, and hiding them in metal containers buried under the ghetto. Most of the participants were murdered, but the archive survived, recovered after the war, and became an irreplaceable historical record of what the Nazis tried to destroy. Ringelblum himself was discovered in hiding in Warsaw in March 1944 and was murdered along with his wife, son, and the Polish family who had sheltered them. Outside of the ghettos and camps, tens of thousands of Jews survived the war by hiding, often at enormous risk to themselves and the people who sheltered them. In the Netherlands, where the Jewish community was nearly 90% destroyed, the Frank family's concealment in the secret annex in Amsterdam was one of thousands of similar attempts to survive in hiding. Anne Frank's diary, discovered after the war and published in 1947, became one of the most widely read documents of the Holocaust and gave a human face to the statistics of destruction. But the Frank family's story also illustrates the terrible odds against survival. They were hidden for more than 2 years before being betrayed to the Gestapo in August 1944, arrested and deported. Anne died of typhus in Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in February or March 1945. Just weeks before the camp was liberated. Her father, Otto, the sole survivor of the family, returned to Amsterdam after the war and devoted the rest of his life to ensuring that Anne's diary was published and read. The question of why more non-Jewish Europeans did not help hide or save their Jewish neighbours is one that haunts the historical record. In most occupied countries, the majority of the population fell into the category of bystanders, neither participating actively in the persecution nor taking significant risks to resist it. A smaller group were collaborators who actively assisted the Nazis in identifying, rounding up, and deporting Jewish people. And a smaller group still were rescuers, who at great personal risk hid and protected Jewish people from the Nazis. The rescuers, honoured by the State of Israel with the designation Righteous Among the Nations, came from every country and every social background. They were farmers and professors, factory workers and aristocrats, devout Christians and secular humanists. What distinguished them was not any simple demographic characteristic, but something more like a combination of moral clarity, practical courage, and the personal relationships and circumstances that brought them into contact with Jewish people who needed help. Raoul Wallenberg was a Swedish diplomat posted to Budapest in 1944 who issued thousands of protective passports to Hungarian Jews, designating them as Swedish subjects awaiting repatriation, and thereby putting them under theoretical Swedish protection. He worked obsessively, sometimes standing in the rain beside deportation trains, handing out protective documents to anyone he could reach, confronting SS officers directly, and saving tens of thousands of lives before the Soviet army captured Budapest. When the Soviets arrived in Sachsenhausen, January 1945, Wallenberg was arrested, apparently on suspicion of being an American spy, and was never seen again. Soviet documents later revealed that he died in Lubyanka prison in Moscow in July 1947. A victim of the Soviet system's paranoid brutality, murdered after having saved tens of thousands of people from the Nazi equivalent. His story is one of the most extraordinary of the entire war, a reminder that individual action could make a difference even in the midst of industrialized murder. Oskar Schindler was a German industrialist and Nazi Party member who saved approximately 1,200 Jews by employing them in his factories in Krakow and later Brno, eventually spending his entire fortune on bribes and black market supplies to keep his workers alive. Schindler was a deeply flawed and morally complicated figure, a womanizer, a war profiteer, and a man who had initially gone to occupied Poland primarily to make money from cheap labor. But somewhere in the process of employing Jewish workers, he developed a personal commitment to their survival that overrode all other considerations. What motivated this transformation is not entirely clear even in hindsight. His factory manager, Itzhak Stern, one of the survivors, later said that Schindler simply could not stand to see innocent people being killed. Whatever his motivation, the result was the survival of roughly 1,200 people who would otherwise have been murdered. These individual stories of rescue and resistance matter not just as inspiring exceptions to the general horror, but because they demonstrate that choice was possible. The executioners, the bureaucrats, the bystanders, and the collaborators all made choices. The choices were constrained by fear, pressure, conditioning, and the mechanics of totalitarian control, but they were choices nonetheless. This is important to remember because it prevents the Holocaust from becoming a kind of natural catastrophe, something that simply happened like a flood or an earthquake. The Holocaust was made by human decisions at every level from the highest to the lowest, and it could therefore have been prevented by different human decisions at multiple points along the way. Let us now examine the specific role of Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, in the implementation of the persecution. Himmler was in many ways the most important single figure in the actual execution of the Holocaust, the man who built and commanded the bureaucratic and military apparatus through which the mass murder was carried out. Born in Munich in 1900 to a devout Catholic family, Himmler had an unremarkable early career as an agronomist and chicken farmer before joining the Nazi Party in the early 1920s. He rose through the party ranks primarily through administrative ability, organizational talent, and complete personal loyalty to Hitler. By 1929, he had been appointed leader of the SS, then a small bodyguard unit, and over the following years, he built it into one of the most powerful and feared organizations in history, encompassing not just the original protection detail, but the Gestapo, the Waffen-SS military force, the concentration camp system, and the entire apparatus of racial persecution. Himmler was in some ways an even more committed racial ideologist than Hitler himself. Where Hitler's antisemitism was rooted in personal resentment and political calculation as well as ideology, Himmler's had a more bureaucratic and pseudoscientific character. He was genuinely fascinated by racial theory, genealogy, and what he believed to be the mystical heritage of the Aryan race. He sponsored archaeological expeditions looking for evidence of ancient Aryan civilization, supported research into alternative medicine and folk customs he associated with Germanic tradition, and maintained a personal collection of books on racial science and European prehistory. His personal manner was almost comically mundane, the mild-mannered, bespectacled chicken farmer who organized industrial murder with the same methodical efficiency he might have applied to agricultural planning. Himmler's famous Posen speech, delivered to senior SS officers in October 1943, is one of the most chilling documents of the Nazi period, precisely because of its matter-of-fact tone. In this speech, Himmler explicitly acknowledged that the Jews were being exterminated, describing it as a difficult page in our history, a page that can never be written and never will be written. He praised the psychological strength of the SS men who had carried out the killings while remaining decent, using the word anständig, decent, to describe men who had just murdered millions of people. He described the killing as a historical necessity and expressed confidence that Germany would survive the judgment of history. This speech demonstrated the degree to which the leaders of the genocide had convinced themselves that what they were doing was not merely permissible but heroic and necessary, a service to history that required the suppression of natural human revulsion. The role of other key Nazi figures in the persecution is also worth examining in detail, because the Holocaust was a collective enterprise that required the participation of the entire machinery of the German state. Reinhard Heydrich, who chaired the Wannsee Conference, was perhaps the most feared man in the Third Reich after Hitler and Himmler. He headed the Reich Main Security Office, which encompassed the Gestapo, the criminal police, and the intelligence service. Tall, blonde, and athletic, he was the physical embodiment of the Aryan ideal that the Nazis preached, an irony made particularly sharp by the persistent rumour, which he himself was aware of and which haunted him, that he had a Jewish great-grandfather. Heydrich was assassinated in Prague in June 1942 by Czech and Slovak resistance fighters who had been trained and parachuted in by the British Special Operations Executive. The Nazi reprisal for his death was savage. The village of Lidis, which had no provable connection to the assassination, was entirely destroyed. Its male population shot, its women and children sent to concentration camps, and the village itself levelled to the ground. Adolf Eichmann, who organised the logistics of the deportation system, escaped to Argentina after the war under the false name Ricardo Clement, where he lived quietly for over a decade before being located by Israeli intelligence. In May 1960, a Mossad team abducted him in a Buenos Aires suburb and transported him to Israel, where he was tried in Jerusalem in 1961. The trial, which was attended by journalists from around the world and was extensively covered by the international press, served an important historical function beyond the question of Eichmann's individual guilt. It put the testimony of Holocaust survivors before a global audience for the first time at such scale and in such detail. Hundreds of survivors testified about what had happened to them and their families, and the world heard these testimonies in real time, many for the first time. Eichmann was found guilty of crimes against humanity, crimes against the Jewish people, and war crimes, and was hanged in May 1962, the only person ever executed by the State of Israel. Julius Streicher, whose newspaper Der Stürmer had been spreading the most vicious anti-Semitic propaganda throughout the Nazi period, was captured by American forces in 1945 while living in disguise as a painter in Bavaria. He was tried at Nuremberg and was one of the 12 defendants sentenced to death. His defense was essentially that he had only written and spoken, not killed anyone directly, but the tribunal found that his years of inflammatory propaganda had constituted incitement to genocide. He was hanged in October 1946. His last words on the scaffold were Heil Hitler and Purim Fest, 1946, a reference to the Jewish holiday of Purim, which commemorates the foiling of a plot to massacre the Jews of ancient Persia. Streicher's defiance at the moment of his execution exemplified the total absence of remorse or self-reflection that characterized the most committed Nazi ideologues even in defeat. Joseph Goebbels, who had built the propaganda apparatus that had so effectively normalized antisemitism in German society, remained in the Führerbunker in Berlin until the very end. When it became clear that Germany was defeated and Hitler had committed suicide on April 30th, 1945, Goebbels and his wife Magda made the decision to kill their 6 children rather than allow them to grow up in a world without National Socialism. The children, aged 4 to 12, were sedated and then poisoned. Goebbels and Magda then died themselves, Magda by gunshot and Joseph by gunshot, or by biting on a cyanide capsule while being shot. It was a final act of fanatical devotion to the ideology that had cost so many millions their lives, and a terrible final expression of the absolute priority that the most committed Nazis placed on ideology over even the most fundamental human bonds. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe and one of the most powerful men in the Third Reich, who had signed the authorization for Heydrich to organize the final solution in July 1941, was captured by American forces in May 1945 and became the most prominent defendant at the Nuremberg trials. Göring was intelligent, charismatic, and utterly unrepentant. He dominated the courtroom, argued his case effectively, and seemed to enjoy the attention. He was found guilty of all 4 counts against him, including crimes against humanity and genocide, and was sentenced to death by hanging. The night before his scheduled execution in October 1946, he bit on a cyanide capsule that had been smuggled into his cell, evading the gallows and adding one final act of defiance to a life that had caused incalculable suffering. But perhaps the most important question we can ask as we survey the landscape of the Holocaust is not simply who did what, but whether the persecution of the Jews was in any sense inevitable once Hitler came to power, or whether different choices at different moments might have led to different outcomes. This is both a historical and a moral question, and historians approach it with understandable caution, since counterfactual history can easily become speculation. But the evidence suggests that the escalation from discrimination to genocide was not inevitable, that it required decisions made under specific circumstances that might have been made differently, and that the failure to make different choices at critical junctures was a moral as well as a historical catastrophe. In 1933, when the Nazis first began their persecution, the outcome was not foreordained. The Nazi regime was new and fragile. Its leaders were testing the limits of what they could do without triggering domestic or international resistance. Different response from the German military, the German churches, the German business community, or the democratic governments of Europe and America might have constrained or deterred the escalation. A more generous international refugee policy might have allowed a larger proportion of German Jews to escape before the war made escape impossible. A firm military response to Hitler's illegal rearmament or his remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936 might have destabilized his regime before it had consolidated totalitarian control. None of these counterfactuals can be proven to have changed the ultimate outcome, but they remind us that the Holocaust was not a natural phenomenon that could not be prevented or interrupted. It was a political and human phenomenon, and political and human choices could have altered its course. There is also a question that must be asked, uncomfortable as it is, about the specific responses of the international Jewish community during this period. Some Jewish leaders in the occupied territories, including members of the Judenrat or Jewish councils that the Nazis established to administer the ghettos, faced agonizing choices between cooperation and resistance. Some chose cooperation, reasoning that by managing the deportations themselves, they could at least ensure that the weakest and most vulnerable were protected as long as possible, and that the overall death toll would be lower. Others resisted from the beginning. The moral complexity of the positions they faced is almost incomprehensible to those who did not live through it, and the historian Primo Levi, who survived Auschwitz and became one of its most important witnesses, warned against judging the choices of victims by the standards of the free. To judge those who were subjected to impossible choices from the outside without having been subjected to the same pressures is a form of moral arrogance that history does not support. The liberation of the camps in the spring of 1945 revealed the full horror of what had been done. American troops who entered Dachau on April 29, 1945, were confronted with scenes of skeletal survivors, piles of corpses, and the evidence of systematic industrial murder. Many of the soldiers had been told something about concentration camps but were completely unprepared for the physical reality. Some broke down in tears. Others were overcome with a rage that in several documented cases resulted in the extrajudicial killing of SS guards. General Dwight Eisenhower, who visited the newly liberated Ohrdruf camp, ordered that film cameras record everything they saw, because he anticipated that the world might someday refuse to believe what had happened. He was prescient. Holocaust denial began almost immediately after the war and has never entirely disappeared. The Nuremberg trials, conducted between November 1945 and October 1946, were the most important judicial response to the crimes of the Nazi era. 24 senior Nazi leaders were indicted on charges including crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The trials established important legal precedents, including the principle that there was no defense of following orders for crimes against humanity, and that individuals could be held criminally responsible for participating in a state-sponsored program of mass murder. 12 defendants were sentenced to death and executed. 7 received prison sentences ranging from 10 years to life. 3 were acquitted, and 1 was declared medically unfit to stand trial, while another committed suicide before the proceedings concluded. The Nuremberg principles established at these trials became the foundation of international humanitarian law and the conceptual basis for subsequent international criminal tribunals, including those established after the genocides in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s. Not all perpetrators were caught or punished. Thousands of former Nazis, including some who had participated directly in the killing program, managed to escape justice through various means. The Ratlines escape networks, often using South American and Middle Eastern destinations, helped former SS men obtain false documents and passage out of Europe. Some found refuge in the United States, Canada, and Australia, where they lived out their lives in obscurity with the assistance of governments that were more interested in recruiting their expertise, particularly in intelligence and rocketry, than in prosecuting their crimes. The case of Klaus Barbie, the Gestapo chief of Lyon, who was known as the Butcher of Lyon for his torture and murder of hundreds of Jews and resistance fighters, is particularly egregious. Barbie was recruited by American intelligence after the war, used as an informant in Germany, and then helped escape to Bolivia in 1951 with U.S. assistance. He lived there under a false name until journalists tracked him down in 1972. And he was not, finally extradited to France and brought to trial until 1987, when he was 83 years old. He was convicted of crimes against humanity and died in prison in 1991. The story of the hunt for Nazi war criminals is itself a remarkable chapter in post-war history, driven primarily by the tireless work of individuals like Simon Wiesenthal, a Holocaust survivor from Austria who dedicated his life to documenting and publicizing the cases of escaped perpetrators and pressuring governments to pursue them. Wiesenthal's Vienna-based documentation center tracked down over 1,100 Nazi war criminals over the course of his long career, including the identification of Eichmann in Argentina, which led to his capture by Mossad. Wiesenthal died in 2005 at the age of 96, having spent more than half a century pursuing justice for the victims of the Holocaust. His work, and the work of organizations that followed in his path, ensured that the question of accountability for the Holocaust remained alive in the public consciousness for decades after the war's end. The question of how Germany as a society came to terms with the crimes committed in its name is one that has been asked and answered differently in different periods since 1945. In the immediate post-war years, many Germans engaged in what historians call a collective amnesia about their participation in or knowledge of the regime's crimes. Former Nazis were quietly reintegrated into the Federal Republic's professional and political life. The Cold War created pressure to quickly rehabilitate West Germany as a reliable NATO ally against the Soviet threat, which provided political incentive to draw a line under the past. Konrad Adenauer, the Federal Republic's first chancellor, was himself personally untainted by Nazism and genuinely committed to making amends for the crimes of the Nazi era, including negotiating a reparations agreement with Israel in 1952 that provided billions of marks to Holocaust survivors and to the new state. But Adenauer also staffed his government with former Nazis, including his chief of staff, Hans Globke, who had written the legal commentary to the Nuremberg laws on the grounds that there were not enough untainted Germans available to run the government otherwise. The real confrontation with the Nazi past in Germany came gradually over subsequent decades, driven in part by the efforts of a younger generation that had not grown up under Nazism and was determined to understand what their parents and grandparents had done. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials of 1963 to 1965, in which 22 former Auschwitz guards and functionaries were prosecuted in German courts, brought detailed testimony about the camp's operations before a West German audience for the first time, and had a profound impact on public consciousness. The student movements of the late 1960s confronted the older generation with demands for accountability, and the gradual emergence of Holocaust survivor testimony in memoirs, films, and finally in the massive Shoah testimonial project organized by filmmaker Claude Lanzmann, and later in the USC Shoah Foundation's archive established by Steven Spielberg after the film Schindler's List, ensured that the personal human reality of the Holocaust remained vivid and present for succeeding generations. Germany today has gone further than perhaps any other country in history in its formal acknowledgement of its crimes. Holocaust education is mandatory in German schools. Holocaust denial is a criminal offence. The government maintains dozens of memorial sites and provides substantial ongoing funding for Holocaust research, education, and commemoration. German leaders have made repeated formal statements of acknowledgement and apology. Willy Brandt's famous knee fall, or genuflection, in Warsaw in December 1970, when the German Chancellor spontaneously fell to his knees before the memorial to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, was one of the most powerful symbolic acts of national contrition in history, and it moved many people who had expected simply a formal speech. Germany's model of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, or coming to terms with the past, is widely cited by scholars and policymakers dealing with other societies that have committed mass atrocities as an example of what a genuine reckoning looks like. However imperfect and incomplete such a reckoning inevitably is. None of this, of course, brings back the 6 million who were murdered, or undoes the destruction of centuries of Jewish culture in Europe, or heals the wounds that survivors and their descendants carry to this day. The question of how a civilized society produced the Holocaust remains one of the most disturbing and important questions in human history, precisely because it cannot be dismissed as an aberration unique to Germany or to the particular circumstances of the 20th century. The ingredients that made the Holocaust possible, the ancient tradition of scapegoating minorities, the pseudo-scientific legitimization of prejudice, the political exploitation of economic resentment, the elimination of democratic institutions and press freedom, the incremental normalization of cruelty, the bureaucratization of violence, and the psychological mechanisms that allow ordinary people to participate in or acquiesce to atrocity, none of these are uniquely German phenomena. They are, to varying degrees, features of human social psychology that can be activated under the right conditions in any society. This brings us to one of the most profound and difficult aspects of the entire question we have been examining: the relationship between the Holocaust and the broader history of European antisemitism. We have traced the specific circumstances that enabled the Nazi genocide, from Hitler's personal psychology and political genius for exploiting resentment, through the specific context of Weimar Germany's political crisis, to the bureaucratic machinery of the SS and the decisions made at Wannsee. But we must also situate the Holocaust in the longer arc of Jewish history in Europe, because to understand it fully, we need to understand not just why Hitler hated the Jews, but why that hatred resonated so powerfully with so many people in so many countries across an entire continent. The political scientist Zygmunt Bauman, in his 1989 study Modernity and the Holocaust, argued that the Holocaust was not a breakdown of modernity, but one of its products, that the same rationalized bureaucratic organization, the same application of scientific and technical thinking to social problems, and the same disenchantment of the world that had produced the great achievements of modern civilization also created the tools and the moral framework that made industrial genocide possible. This is a disturbing thesis, but it is one that the evidence supports. The Holocaust was not a medieval pogrom. It was a modern, bureaucratic operation, planned in conference rooms, administered through government departments, carried out with the technical resources of the most advanced industrial state in Europe, and made possible by a modern ideology that dressed ancient prejudice in the language of science, history, and national necessity. The Holocaust also raises profound questions about the relationship between ideology and action. There is a long-standing debate in Holocaust historiography between what are often called intentionalists, who argue that Hitler had a clear genocidal intention from early in his political career and that the Holocaust was the planned implementation of that intention, and functionalists or structuralists who argue that the genocide emerged more organically from the dynamics of the Nazi state, from cumulative radicalization, bureaucratic competition, and the logic of the regime's own operation. The historian Christopher Browning has proposed a synthesis he calls moderate intentionalism, arguing that Hitler had long-standing genocidal goals, but that the specific decision and timing of the final solution were shaped by the particular circumstances of the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. Most contemporary historians accept some version of this synthesis, but the intentionalist-functionalist debate, for all its importance to specialists, should not distract from the central moral reality that the Holocaust was deliberately willed and carried out by specific human beings who made specific choices. Whatever the precise decision-making process that led to the gas chambers of Auschwitz, the people who built and operated those chambers knew what they were doing. The people who organized the deportations knew where the trains were going. The political leadership that created the legal framework of persecution, from the Nuremberg laws to the Wannsee Conference, were not blind to the direction in which their policies were moving. The claim of ignorance that so many perpetrators and bystanders made after the war was, in the vast majority of cases, a lie. One of the most important lessons of the Holocaust for the present day is what the sociologist Gregory Stanton has identified as the stages of genocide, a framework developed through the study of multiple 20th century genocides, including the Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide, and the Cambodian killing fields. Stanton identified 10 stages that typically precede and accompany genocide: classification, symbolization, discrimination, dehumanization, organization, polarization, preparation, persecution, extermination, and denial. Looking back at the history of the Nazi persecution of the Jews, we can see all 10 of these stages clearly present and progressing in roughly this order. Classification came first, in the racial laws that defined who was and was not a Jew. Symbolization followed, in the requirement for Jews to wear the yellow Star of David from 1941 onward. Discrimination was implemented through the progressive legal exclusion from public life. Dehumanization was accomplished through the propaganda machine. Organization was provided by the SS and its apparatus. Polarization was achieved through the sustained political campaign portraying Jews as Germany's ultimate enemy. Preparation took the form of the ghetto system and the construction of the extermination camps. Persecution was the systematic implementation of the killing program. Extermination was the murder of 6 million people. And denial came both during the process, through the use of euphemisms and secrecy, and after it, through the claims of ignorance and the revisionism that continues to this day. Stanton's framework is important because it suggests that genocide is not a sudden eruption, but a process that unfolds in stages over time, and that intervention at any stage before the final one can prevent the catastrophe. The stages of escalation in the Nazi persecution are clearly visible in retrospect. What is less clear is what the threshold should have been for international and domestic intervention, and why that threshold was never reached. These questions have direct relevance not just to the Holocaust, but to the multiple cases of mass atrocity and genocide that have occurred since 1945, including Cambodia, Bosnia, Rwanda, Darfur, and Myanmar, in all of which the international community has similarly failed to intervene effectively until massive death tolls had been accumulated. The specific question of why international institutions, including the League of Nations and later the United Nations, have so often failed to prevent or stop genocide, is connected to the same structural factors that enabled the Holocaust. The reluctance of sovereign states to intervene in the internal affairs of other states, even when those internal affairs involve mass murder, is deeply rooted in the post-Westphalian international order that treats sovereignty as the supreme organizing principle of world politics. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948, and the Genocide Convention of the same year were both direct responses to the Holocaust and represented an attempt to establish that there were some crimes so serious that the international community had both the right and the obligation to intervene to stop them regardless of national sovereignty. The Genocide Convention specifically defined genocide and obligated signatory states to prevent and punish it. But the practical mechanisms for enforcement remained weak, and as subsequent genocides demonstrated, the rhetoric of never again has proven far easier to proclaim than to implement. The memory of the Holocaust has become one of the central reference points of contemporary Western moral and political culture. The phrase "never again," which originated in Jewish commemorative language after the war, has been adopted as a universal aspiration, an insistence that the specific combination of dehumanization, state power, and bureaucratic murder that produced the Holocaust must never be allowed to recur. Holocaust Memorial Days are observed in dozens of countries. Holocaust museums and memorial sites have been established across Europe, North America, and Israel. The Holocaust is taught in schools in most Western countries and increasingly around the world. The Yad Vashem Memorial in Jerusalem, established in 1953, maintains the most comprehensive archive of Holocaust documentation in the world, including the names of approximately 4.8 million of the 6 million murdered Jews that have been identified, with ongoing efforts to identify the remaining 1.2 million. The The State of Israel itself was in large part a direct consequence of the Holocaust, though Zionism, the movement for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, had been growing since the late 19th century, and the decision to support a Jewish state in Palestine had been made by the British in the Balfour Declaration of 1917. But the Holocaust dramatically changed the political calculus around Zionism by demonstrating, with terrible finality, the consequences of the Jewish people's lack of a state and a territory of their own in which they were sovereign and protected. The United Nations Partition Plan for Palestine, adopted in November 1947, and the subsequent declaration of Israeli independence in May 1948 were shaped by the Holocaust's shadow, by the overwhelming moral case for a Jewish homeland made by the survivors who had nowhere else to go, and whose reception in many countries remained unwelcoming even after the war. The legacy of the Holocaust for contemporary Jewish life is profound and complex. For survivors, many of whom did not speak publicly about their experiences for decades, the trauma was often carried in silence, transferred to their children and grandchildren through what psychologists call intergenerational trauma, the transmission of psychological wounds across generations, even when the specific traumatic events are not directly communicated. The work of helping survivors tell their stories, begun in earnest from the 1970s onward, and the massive archive of survivor testimony collected by the USC Shoah Foundation and other organizations, has created a historical record of extraordinary human and scholarly importance. But it has also raised profound questions about the ethics of testimony, memory and representation, questions about who has the right to speak for the dead, and how the unspeakable should be spoken. The question of Holocaust representation in art and literature is one that writers and artists have grappled with continuously since 1945. The philosopher Theodor Adorno famously wrote in 1949, in a much misunderstood formulation, that to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric, meaning not that art was literally impossible after the Holocaust, but that the aestheticization of extreme suffering, the transformation of mass murder into beautiful form, risked a kind of obscenity. Subsequent thinkers and artists have reached varied conclusions about how this challenge should be navigated. Elie Wiesel, a survivor of Auschwitz and Buchenwald who went on to become the most widely read and influential witness writer of the Holocaust, insisted that the duty to bear witness overrode any purely aesthetic considerations. His memoir Night, published in 1958, stripped bare of literary ornament and written in a voice of almost unbearable simplicity, has become one of the most widely read books about the Holocaust in the world, and has introduced tens of millions of readers to the experience of the camps. Wiesel received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1986, and in his acceptance speech he spoke of the danger of indifference, arguing that indifference, even more than hatred, was the true enemy of humanity. Primo Levi, who survived Auschwitz because his skills as a chemist made him useful to the German synthetic rubber industry, wrote a series of memoirs and essays about his experience that combined precise observational detail, philosophical depth, and moral complexity in a way that has made him one of the indispensable witnesses of the 20th century. If This Is a Man, published in Italy in 1947, and The Drowned and the Saved, his last book published just before his death in 1987, are essential reading for anyone who wants to understand both the mechanisms and the moral dimensions of the Holocaust. Levi was deeply interested in the grey zone, his term for the morally ambiguous territory occupied by those who were neither purely victims nor purely perpetrators, including the Sonderkommando, the Kapos, and the members of the Jewish councils, whose choices under impossible conditions resist simple moral judgment. His death in April 1987, which many believe was a suicide, was a reminder that the trauma of Auschwitz was never truly over for those who had survived it. Imre Kertész, a Hungarian Jewish survivor who was deported to Auschwitz in 1944 at the age of 14 and who received the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2002, wrote fiction that explored the experience of the Holocaust from the inside, focusing particularly on the question of how individual subjectivity survives or fails to survive total dehumanization. His novel Fatelessness, published in 1975, deliberately told the story of a young concentration camp prisoner in a flat, almost affectless voice that challenged the expectation that the Holocaust should be experienced as pure horror, arguing instead that the gradual nature of the dehumanization process meant that the victim often did not immediately recognize the full horror of their situation. This narrative strategy was controversial, but represented an important and honest attempt to convey the psychological truth of an experience that does not conform to the expectations of tragedy. The literature of witness, produced by survivors, is only one part of the enormous body of cultural, artistic, and intellectual work that the Holocaust has generated. Historians, including Raoul Hilberg, whose monumental 1961 study, The Destruction of the European Jews, was the first comprehensive scholarly account of the entire administrative and operational history of the Holocaust, have produced a body of documentation that makes the Holocaust one of the most thoroughly studied events in human history. The Nuremberg trial records alone run to tens of thousands of pages. The documentary records of the Nazi bureaucracy, many of which the Nazis themselves preserved with typically German thoroughness, provide an extraordinarily detailed picture of how the persecution was planned and implemented. And the growing archive of testimony from survivors, perpetrators, and bystanders continues to enrich and complicate our understanding. We should also examine how the specific experience of Jewish communities varied across the different countries of occupied Europe, because the Holocaust was not a single uniform experience, but a collection of different national stories, each with its own distinctive character shaped by local history, culture, and the specific circumstances of German occupation. In Poland, where the largest pre-war Jewish community in Europe, numbering over 3 million people, had lived for centuries, the destruction was almost total. Over 90% of Polish Jews were murdered, a catastrophe of almost incomprehensible proportions that wiped out not just individuals but entire communities, cultural traditions, languages and ways of life that had developed over many generations. In France, where the Jewish community was more integrated into the surrounding society, the collaboration of the Vichy government in the roundup and deportation of Jewish people was made possible in part by the pre-existing tradition of French antisemitism, exemplified most dramatically by the Dreyfus affair of the 1890s, in which a Jewish army captain was falsely convicted of treason on anti-Semitic grounds, and by the large number of native French fascists who saw collaboration with Germany as an opportunity to pursue their own anti-Semitic agenda. In the Netherlands, the German occupation was particularly thorough, and the local administration more cooperative than in some other countries, with the result that the Dutch Jewish community lost approximately 75% of its members, one of the highest proportional losses in Western Europe. In Denmark, by contrast, the small Jewish community was almost entirely saved through a remarkable collective act of resistance in October 1943, when ordinary Danish citizens spontaneously organised a boat rescue that ferried over 7,000 Danish Jews to neutral Sweden in the space of a few days. The Danish rescue, which stood in such stark contrast to the collaboration and indifference seen elsewhere, has become one of the most studied and celebrated examples of collective moral courage in the Holocaust period. Historians have debated what made Denmark different from other occupied countries, with suggestions ranging from the strong Danish tradition of civil society and individual rights to the specific political circumstances of the German occupation, which was administered more leniently in Denmark than elsewhere because the Nazis considered Danes to be a racially kindred Nordic people. But, whatever the explanation, the Danish example demonstrated that collective action to save Jewish lives was possible, and that the outcome in other countries was not determined by fate, but by human choices. In Hungary, the story took a particularly horrifying late turn. Hungary was an Axis ally of Germany and had implemented its own anti-Semitic legislation in the late 1930s, but the Hungarian government of Admiral Miklos Horthy had resisted German pressure to deport its Jewish population to the extermination camps. As a result, while Jews in Hungary suffered severe discrimination and persecution, a community of approximately 760,000 people survived into 1944. Then, in March 1944, Germany occupied Hungary militarily, deposed Horthy's government, installed a puppet administration, and immediately began organizing mass deportations. Within 10 weeks, between May and July 1944, over 437,000 Hungarian Jews had been deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau and murdered. It was the fastest mass murder operation of the entire Holocaust. Only the intervention of Horthy, who halted the deportations in July 1944 under combined domestic and international pressure, saved the approximately 200,000 Jews of Budapest from the same fate, though they remained in severe danger until the end of the war. The story of the Hungarian deportations also illustrates the central role of Adolf Eichmann in the logistics of the final solution. Eichmann personally travelled to Budapest to oversee the deportations, working with the compliant Hungarian administration to organise the trains and the paperwork with his customary bureaucratic efficiency. His later claim at his Jerusalem trial that he was just following orders was challenged by the evidence that he had travelled to Budapest of his own initiative and had negotiated with Hungarian officials with considerable personal enthusiasm. Eichmann's operational role in the Hungarian deportations, carried out in the middle of Germany's military crisis in 1944, when every available train was supposedly needed for military transport, provides some of the clearest evidence that the destruction of the Jews had become, for Hitler and for those who served him, an absolute priority that superseded all other considerations, including the military survival of Germany itself. What about the Sonderkommando, those Jewish prisoners who were forced to operate the crematoria at Auschwitz and other camps, who sorted through the belongings of the newly gassed and dragged the bodies to the ovens? Their situation represents perhaps the most extreme example of the grey zone that Primo Levi wrote about, the impossible moral terrain between victim and perpetrator that the SS deliberately created in order to make resistance harder and complicity more widespread. The Sonderkommando were selected from among newly arrived prisoners, given slightly better food and conditions, and tasked with work that would have destroyed almost anyone psychologically. They knew that they themselves would eventually be killed to prevent them from bearing witness, a fact that proved correct for the vast majority. Those who survived did so primarily by participating in the October 1944 uprising. The remarkable scroll testimony left behind by several Sonderkommando members, buried in the ground near the crematoria and discovered after the war, provides some of the most direct and devastating accounts of what happened inside the gas chambers and ovens. These testimonies, like all the testimonies of Holocaust survivors and witnesses, carry a moral weight that goes beyond their historical importance. They are not just documents. They are acts of trust extended from the dead to the living, an insistence that what happened should be known and remembered, and an implicit challenge to those who receive the trust to do something worthy of it. The question of what we owe to the dead, and particularly to those who died in the most extreme and deliberate circumstances, is one that the Holocaust poses with unique force. It does not have a simple answer. But at minimum, it seems to require honesty about what happened, vigilance against the forces that made it possible, and a commitment to the principle that every human being possesses a dignity that cannot be legitimately stripped away by the ideology of any state. The mechanisms by which Hitler and the Nazis stripped Jewish people of their dignity, their legal rights, their economic means, their freedom of movement, their communities, their families, and finally their lives, can be traced in extraordinary detail through the historical record. And what that record reveals, above all, is the importance of each individual step in the process. None of the later horrors was possible without the earlier ones. The gas chambers of Auschwitz were built on the foundation of the Nuremberg Laws. The Nuremberg Laws were built on the foundation of the boycotts and dismissals of 1933. Those were built on the foundation of the anti-Semitic ideology that Hitler had been developing since his Vienna years, which was itself built on the foundation of 15 centuries of European Christian anti-Semitism. And underneath all of it was the most fundamental element, the willingness of enough people at each stage to look away, to go along, to calculate their own advantage, and to abdicate the moral responsibility that being human entails. This is why the question of why Hitler persecuted the Jews is ultimately not just a historical question. It is a question about the nature of human societies and the conditions under which ordinary people can be led, step by step, into complicity with extraordinary evil. The lesson it teaches is not comforting. It does not tell us that evil is always obvious, that good people will always recognize it and resist it, or that the structures of civilization are strong enough to contain it indefinitely. The lesson is more demanding than that. It tells us that evil can be made to seem normal through incremental escalation, that prejudice can be dressed up as science, that scapegoating can be made to feel like justice, and that the bureaucratization of violence can reduce the moral weight of individual decisions to almost nothing. Against these forces, the only reliable defense is not comfort or complacency, but alertness, critical thinking, empathy, and a willingness to resist when resistance is costly. The 6 million Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust died because enough people in enough places failed to resist at enough moments. They died because of Hitler's ideology and Himmler's organization and Eichmann's bureaucracy, yes, but also because of the French gendarme who loaded Jews onto a bus, the Dutch administrator who compiled a census that identified Jewish households, the Hungarian railway worker who drove the deportation train, the German neighbor who reported the family hiding in the basement, and the American diplomat who found a bureaucratic reason to deny a visa. The Holocaust was the product of a vast collective moral failure, and the magnitude of that failure is still being reckoned with more than 80 years after the last camp was liberated. What is remarkable in the face of all this horror is the survival and resilience of the Jewish people. A third of the world's Jewish population was murdered in the Holocaust, the most devastating blow ever suffered by any people in recorded history. The Jewish communities of Poland, Ukraine, Hungary, the Baltic states, and much of the rest of Europe were effectively annihilated. The Yiddish language and culture, which had been the vibrant heart of European Jewish life for centuries, was destroyed as a living cultural tradition in most of the places where it had flourished. And yet, the Jewish people survived, rebuilt, created the State of Israel, maintained their cultural traditions, produced some of the 20th century's greatest scientists, writers, artists, and thinkers, and ensured that the story of what was done to them would be told. This survival is not a redemptive ending to the story. There is no redemption that undoes the deaths of 6 million people, but it is a testimony to something real about human resilience, the capacity of communities and cultures to survive and rebuild, even from the most catastrophic possible beginning. Before we bring this exploration to a close, we should also acknowledge something that is often overlooked in discussions of the Holocaust, the profound importance of Jewish cultural and intellectual life that was destroyed. Pre-war Europe, and particularly Central and Eastern Europe, contained a vibrant, centuries-old Jewish civilization that produced extraordinary contributions to medicine, science, philosophy, literature, and the arts. The concentration of Jewish intellectual talent in German-speaking Europe in the early 20th century was remarkable by any measure. Einstein, Freud, Kafka, Mahler, Wittgenstein, Walter Benjamin, Hannah Arendt, and dozens of other towering figures of modern thought and culture were products of this world. The Jewish communities of Warsaw, Vilna, Krakow, Lemberg, Odessa, and hundreds of smaller towns and shtetls had their own rich traditions of religious scholarship, secular education, political activism, and cultural creativity. The Holocaust did not merely murder 6 million individuals, it deliberately and systematically destroyed a civilization, burning its books, silencing its musicians, emptying its synagogues, and erasing the accumulated wisdom and creativity of generations. The magnitude of that cultural loss on top of the human loss is something we are still only beginning to fully comprehend. We began this video by asking why Hitler persecuted the Jews, and the answer we have traced is a long and terrible one. It is rooted in 15 centuries of Christian antisemitism that normalized the idea of Jews as alien and hostile. It was shaped by the 19th century's racial pseudoscience that transformed religious prejudice into biological determinism. It was catalyzed by Germany's defeat in World War I and the toxic mythology of the stab in the back that directed the desire for revenge inward against a convenient scapegoat. It was systematized by Hitler's ideology, developed in the failures and resentments of his Vienna years and given full expression in Mein Kampf. It was implemented through the political machinery of the Nazi state, through Nuremberg laws, boycotts, pogroms, ghettos, mobile killing units, and finally, extermination camps. It was enabled by the failure of the German churches, the international community, and the majority of ordinary Germans to resist or refuse at the moments when resistance might have mattered. And it was carried out by a combination of fanatical true believers and ordinary people who found themselves doing extraordinary evil through the mechanisms of bureaucracy, conformity, self-interest, and the gradual normalization of cruelty. The question why had many answers, and none of them are simple, but understanding them as fully and as honestly as we can is perhaps the most important intellectual and moral obligation that the Holocaust places on those of us who live in its shadow. The 6 million demand nothing less than our full attention to the truth of what happened and why, however uncomfortable and however demanding that truth turns out to be. Well, that is it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. We hope that this deep exploration of why Hitler persecuted the Jews has been both informative and thought-provoking, and that it has shed light on one of the most important and difficult questions in modern history. If you found this video valuable, please make sure to check out our other videos on the history of World War II and the Nazi era, including our explorations of what happened to Germany's top military commanders after the war, and the stories of those who lived under the shadow of the Third Reich. As always, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so that you never miss new content. Hit the notification bell to stay updated on our latest uploads. The history of this era is too important to be forgotten, and we are committed to continuing to bring it to you with the depth and honesty it deserves. See you in the next one.